The silence came first. I had served as Astropath Prime for the Sol system for 117 years. My soul bound to the Golden Throne's radiance since the day the ritual fire branded his mark into my flesh. In all that time, through plagues and rebellions, through the screams of dying worlds echoing across the immaterium, through the endless cacophony of 10,000 souls crying out across the galaxy, there had always been the light, his light, burning constant as a star, warm as a mother's touch upon a fevered brow. The Astronomicon had been my North Star, my anchor in the warp's churning madness, the single certainty in a universe gone insane. Then it died. The moment arrived without fanfare, without the cosmic trembling one might expect when the heart of the galaxy stops beating. I was seated in my sanctum deep beneath the Himalayan peaks, monitoring the psychic traffic flowing through Terra's orbital stations, when the sensation struck me like a physical blow. It was not pain, though pain would have been preferable. It was absence, a hollowness so profound that every nerve in my body recoiled from its touch. The warmth that had lived behind my sternum for over a century simply ceased, leaving behind a coldness that reached down into my bones and made them ache with the memory of winter on a dead world. My augmetic fingers, long since replaced after a warp burn incident decades past, trembled against the communications console. The runes displaying psychic channel activity flickered once, twice, then went dark. In the space of a heartbeat, the invisible threads connecting Terra to every corner of the Imperium simply vanished, cut clean as if by a sword stroke. I reached out with my mind, casting my consciousness into the warp as I had done countless times before. What I found there defied every principle of psychic navigation I had ever learned. The currents that had flowed in predictable patterns for 10 millennia were gone. In their place writhed something altogether more primal, more chaotic. The immaterium had become a roiling sea of raw emotion and unleashed energy, its surface broken by towering waves of pure malice that crashed against one another with the sound of screaming metal. The Astronomicon was not merely dimmed or flickering, it was gone, utterly and completely, leaving behind only the faint psychic echo of its passing like the afterimage of a star burned into the retina. In that moment, I understood with crystalline clarity what had occurred. The God Emperor of mankind, the Master of the Golden Throne, the light of Terra and salvation of the human species, was dead. My first coherent thought was absurdly mundane. I wondered if I should file a report. The absurdity of the notion struck me with hysterical force, and I found myself laughing, though whether from madness or despair I could not say. File a report to whom? The High Lords of Terra, who would be discovering this calamity for themselves in the coming minutes. The Adeptus Astronomica, whose entire purpose had just been rendered obsolete. The trillion souls scattered across the galaxy who were about to learn that their god was mortal after all. The laughter died in my throat as the first tremor ran through the mountain. Not a seismic event, though the sensors registered it as such. This was something deeper, more fundamental. Reality itself was beginning to buckle under the strain of what had just occurred. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's will had held back the tides of chaos through sheer psychic force. His death had not merely extinguished a light, it had torn away a dam that had been holding back an ocean. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. The sanctum's walls, carved from the living rock of Terra's greatest mountain range, seemed to pulse with a rhythm all their own. The blessed oils that had kept the darkness at bay for millennia were already beginning to smoke, their protective properties failing as the warp pressed closer to real space. I could taste copper in the air, and something else, something that made my enhanced senses recoil in disgust. It was the taste of ending, of finality, of a future that would never come to pass. The first Vox transmission reached me 3 minutes after the silence began. The voice belonged to Captain General Valdor's successor, though I could not recall the man's name in that moment. His words were clipped, professional, but I could hear the edge of panic beneath them. All stations, this is the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. We have a Code Omega event in progress. All personnel are to maintain their posts and await further orders. The throne room is sealed. No one enters without my direct authorization. Code Omega. The designation for the Emperor's death had been theoretical for so long that many had forgotten it existed. I had seen it referenced in the most classified documents, spoken of in whispers by those few brave or foolish enough to contemplate the unthinkable. Now it was reality, crackling through the Vox networks with all the terrible finality of a funeral bell. More transmissions followed in rapid succession, each one painting a picture of an Imperium beginning to tear itself apart from within. The Imperial Fist's garrison at the Lion's Gate spaceport was requesting immediate reinforcement after reports of mass rioting in the lower hive levels. The Departamento Munitorum was issuing emergency rationing orders for the entire Sol system. Most disturbing of all, the Adeptus Mechanicus had begun withdrawing their tech priests from critical systems across Terra, citing unforeseen complications in the machine spirits. I knew what those complications were. Every piece of technology blessed by the Omnissiah's grace was feeling the death of the Emperor like a phantom limb. The machine spirits were in agony, their semi-sentient programs struggling to process a reality where their ultimate creator was no longer present to guide their function. Within hours, critical systems across the Imperium would begin failing as their machine spirits fell into madness or despair. The second tremor was stronger than the first, and this time I could see its effects. Cracks appeared in the sanctum's walls, hairline fractures that glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. Through them I could hear something that made my blood freeze. Laughter, not human laughter, but something altogether more alien, more cruel. The denizens of the warp were beginning to notice that the barriers were weakening. I activated my personal Vox link and attempted to contact my fellow astropaths stationed throughout the Sol system. The first 3 channels returned only static. The fourth gave me something worse than silence. It gave me screaming. Astropath Terminus Yellen had been stationed aboard the orbital defense platform Vigilant Guardian for the better part of 50 years. Her voice, when it finally resolved through the interference, was barely recognizable as human. She was speaking in tongues, her words a mixture of High Gothic and something that predated human language entirely. Between the gibberish, I caught fragments of meaning. The platform's void shields were fluctuating. The weapon batteries were firing at targets that did not exist. The crew was reporting visual hallucinations and spontaneous bleeding. The warp was bleeding through. I severed the connection and tried another channel. This time I reached Astropath Prime Hadrian aboard the Fortress Monastery of the Imperial Fists. His voice was calmer than Yellen's, but what he told me was infinitely more terrifying. Kador, thank the throne you're still transmitting. We have a situation here. The chapter master has ordered a full withdrawal from the outer defenses. They're pulling back to the inner keep. Withdrawal. In the Emperor's name, why? Because the outer walls are compromised. Not by enemy action, but by something else. The stone itself is becoming unstable. Chapter Librarian Taurus attempted a divination ritual an hour ago. What he saw drove him to madness. He's been restrained, but not before he started screaming about the crawling dark and the laughter in the stone. The implications struck me like a physical blow. If the Imperial Fists, the most stalwart defenders of Terra, were retreating from their posts, then the situation was far worse than I had imagined. The Fortress Monastery had stood against the siege of Terra itself, had weathered 10 millennia of war and strife without yielding so much as a single meter of ground. If they were falling back now, it meant that the enemy they faced was beyond conventional military response. "What are your orders, Prime?" Hadrian's voice carried the weight of desperate hope, as if my words might somehow provide a solution to the impossible. I had no orders to give. The chain of command that had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years was crumbling along with everything else. Without the Emperor's guidance, without the Astronomicon to coordinate Imperial response across the galaxy, we were not an empire anymore. We were a collection of isolated systems, each one facing the darkness alone. "Maintain your position as long as possible," I told him, though the words felt hollow in my mouth, "and pray that this is not the end of all things." The third tremor brought down a section of the sanctum's ceiling, showering me with ancient stone and blessed mortar. As the dust settled, I saw that the crack in the far wall had widened, and through it seeped something that was not quite light and not quite shadow. It moved with purpose, flowing across the floor like liquid mercury, and where it touched the sanctified stones they began to smoke and bubble. I drew my las pistol, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was coming through. The weapon's machine spirit was already failing, its power cell fluctuating wildly as the device's sacred programming struggled to maintain coherence. Within the hour, every weapon, every vehicle, every piece of technology across the Imperium would be facing the same crisis of faith. Without the Emperor's presence to anchor them, the machine spirits that guided Imperial technology were beginning to lose their sanity. The shadow thing on the floor began to take shape, rising from the stone like smoke given form. I could see hints of what it might become, glimpses of horn and fang and burning eyes that belonged to no creature of real space. This was just the beginning. With the barriers weakening by the moment, horrors beyond imagination would soon be pouring through every crack, every flaw, every moment of weakness in reality's fabric. I closed my eyes and reached out once more with my psychic senses, casting my consciousness as far as I dared into the roiling madness of the warp. What I found there confirmed my worst fears. The galaxy was dying. I could see the great shipping lanes that connected the Imperium's far-flung worlds, the stable warp corridors that had enabled trade and communication for millennia. They were collapsing one by one, consumed by the expanding chaos storms that erupted wherever the Emperor's influence had once held sway. Naval vessels caught in transit were being torn apart by the sudden turbulence, their navigators struck blind by the absence of the Astronomicon, their crews abandoned to madness and death in the howling void between stars. On Makraj, the Ultramarines were mustering their full strength for a war they could not hope to win. Chapter Master Kalgar had issued a call to arms that would never be answered, his words lost in the psychic static that now dominated interstellar communication. The noble Space Marines would fight, of course, as they always had, but they would fight alone, cut off from their brother chapters and the Imperial command structure that had sustained them for so long. The Forge world of Mars was already beginning to tear itself apart as the tech priests struggled to comprehend a reality where the Omnissiah was truly dead. Ancient machines that had functioned flawlessly for millennia were seizing up and dying, their machine spirits unable to process the theological implications of their creator's demise. Within days, the Red Planet would be a tomb world, its surface littered with the corpses of broken machinery and the priests who had died trying to commune with spirits that no longer answered. But perhaps most terrible of all was what I saw happening in the Eye of Terror. That great wound in reality, held in check for 10,000 years by the Emperor's will, was beginning to expand. The Chaos Gods, no longer constrained by his presence, were pouring their full attention into real space, and the barriers that separated the warp from the material universe were cracking under the assault. Soon, daemons would walk openly on every Imperial world, and humanity would learn what it meant to face the full fury of the Dark Gods unleashed. I opened my eyes to find the shadow thing almost fully formed, its shape now recognizably demonic, despite its still translucent nature. It had too many limbs, each one ending in claws that dripped with an ichor that hissed and steamed where it touched the sanctified floor. Its eyes were pits of molten gold, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of children weeping. "Astropath," it whispered, the words somehow managing to convey both mockery and pity. "Do you see now? Do you understand what your god's death has wrought?" I raised my las pistol, though my hand shook so badly that I could barely keep the weapon steady. "I do not speak with daemons." "No?" The creature's laughter was like breaking glass. "Then what have you been doing for the past century?" "Every message you sent, every soul whisper you guided through the warp, every prayer you offered to your corpse god, all of it filtered through our realm. We have been listening, little astropath. We have always been listening." The weapon's machine spirit finally failed, the power cell going dead with a pathetic whimper. I let it fall from my nerveless fingers, the sound of its impact lost beneath the growing rumble of the mountain's structural collapse. "What do you want?" I asked. though I dreaded the answer. "Want?" The daemon seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "We want nothing, little astropath. We have already won. The moment your god corpse finally expired, the galaxy became ours. Every world, every ship, every soul that once sheltered behind his light now belongs to the dark gods. We need do nothing but watch as your species tears itself apart in despair and madness." Another section of the ceiling came down, and with it came more of the strange light that was not light. I could see other shapes moving within it, things with too many eyes or too few faces or appendages that defied geometric logic. The sanctum that had been my refuge for over a century was becoming a portal, a gateway through which the contents of the warp could pour into real space without constraint. I stumbled toward the exit, but the ancient blast door was sealed, its machine spirit either dead or driven mad by the psychic turmoil. The control panel sparked and died as I touched it, the blessed oils in its circuits igniting in a brief flare of holy flame before guttering out forever. "Where will you go, little astropath?" the daemon asked, its voice following me as I searched desperately for another way out. "Your mountain fortress crumbles around you. Your god is dead. Your empire burns. What refuge remains for one such as you?" The question struck deeper than any blade. For over a century, my purpose had been clear. I was a servant of the Emperor, a guardian of his light, a conduit for his will across the vastness of space. Without him, what was I? What was any of us? The Imperium of Man had been more than a political entity, more than a collection of worlds bound together by trade and military might. It had been a faith made manifest, a dream of human unity and purpose given form through the Emperor's divine will. Now that faith was shattered, that dream revealed as nothing more than the dying hallucination of a being who had clung to life far beyond his natural span. Humanity was alone in the darkness once more, as it had been in the Age of Strife, before the Emperor's great crusade had brought the scattered worlds back into the light. But this time would be worse, because this time we knew what we had lost. The Vox channels were alive with reports of disaster and despair from across the Sol system. The population of Terra's hive cities was in full revolt, their faith shattered by the sudden absence of the Emperor's presence. The Adeptus Arbites were fighting pitched battles in the Underhive, but their forces were hopelessly outnumbered by the rioting masses. Worse still, some of the rioters were displaying signs of mutation, their flesh reshaping itself in response to the chaotic energies now flowing freely through real space. On Luna, the gene laboratories of the Adeptus Mechanicus were in complete meltdown. The delicate genetic templates that had produced the Space Marine legions for 10 millennia were beginning to degrade, their sacred patterns corrupted by the warp's touch. Even if the Imperium somehow survived the immediate crisis, it would never again be able to create new Astartes. The Angels of Death would fight their final battles with whatever forces they had remaining, and when they fell, there would be no replacements. The orbital defense platforms that protected Terra from external threat were already showing signs of failure. Their void shields flickered intermittently as their machine spirits struggled to maintain focus, and several weapons batteries had gone offline entirely. If the forces of chaos launched an assault on the Sol system now, they would find the heart of the Imperium virtually defenseless. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the reports coming from the Navigator houses. These ancient bloodlines, whose psychic gifts had enabled faster-than-light travel throughout the galaxy, were dying. Without the Astronomicon to guide them, their third eyes were being burned out by the chaotic energies of the warp, leaving them blind and mad. Within hours, every navigator in the Sol system would be dead or insane, and without them, no ship would dare enter the warp. The Imperium's ability to move between stars was ending forever. A new voice broke through the chaos on the Vox channels, and my blood chilled as I recognized it. Lord Commander Militant Draken Vangorich, one of the High Lords of Terra, was speaking directly to the population of the throne world itself. Citizens of the Imperium. His voice was steady, but I could hear the desperation beneath the calm facade. We are facing a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The Emperor, may his name be blessed, has been grievously wounded, and his recovery is uncertain. Until he is restored to full strength, all imperial citizens are ordered to remain calm and maintain their faith. Any reports of the emperor's death are to be considered heretical propaganda and will be punished accordingly. The lie was pathetic in its transparency, but I understood why it was necessary. If the population learned the truth, that their god emperor was truly dead, the resulting chaos would tear apart what remained of imperial authority within hours. Better to maintain the fiction for as long as possible, to give the High Lords time to do what? There was no contingency plan for this scenario, no protocol for the death of a god. The Imperium had been built on the assumption that the Emperor was eternal, that his light would burn forever in the darkness of space. That assumption had proven false, and now we were all paying the price for our hubris. The daemon had grown more solid while I was distracted by the Vox transmissions, its form now completely opaque and terrifyingly real. It stood nearly 3 meters tall, its chitinous hide gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected light in impossible colors. When it moved, reality seemed to bend around it, as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions in its presence. "Your lords lie to preserve order," it said, its voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty. But lies cannot hold back the truth forever. Already the faithful begin to doubt. Already the weak seek new gods to worship. We are patient, little astropath. We have waited 10,000 years for this moment. We can wait a few hours more for your species to accept its fate. I found myself thinking of the billions of imperial citizens scattered across the galaxy, all of them suddenly cut off from the light that had guided their lives since birth. How long would it take them to realize that their prayers were no longer being answered? How long before despair gave way to rage, before faith transformed into heresy, before the desperate began reaching out to new powers that promised salvation at any price? On the agri-world of Ceres Prime, I knew that planetary governor Marcus Aurelius would be struggling to maintain order as his population descended into panic. The agricultural servitors that fed half the sector were beginning to malfunction as their machine spirits failed, threatening starvation on a scale not seen since the Age of Strife. The governor was a good man, faithful and just, but what could one man do against the collapse of everything he had ever believed in? The Forge world of Lucius would be facing a different but equally terrible crisis. The tech priests there had devoted their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, believing that understanding was a form of worship. But what happened to their faith when the object of their worship was revealed to be as mortal as any other being? Some would doubtless cling to their beliefs, insisting that the Omnissiah had merely transcended to a higher plane of existence. Others would embrace despair, seeing in the Emperor's death proof that their entire philosophy was built on falsehood. And a few, the most dangerous few, would begin to look for new sources of forbidden knowledge, turning their attention to the dark sciences of chaos. The hive world of Necromunda would probably fare better than most, in its own twisted way. The gang wars and industrial violence that were daily facts of life there had already prepared the population for a harsh existence without hope or succor. The death of the Emperor might hardly register among people who had never expected mercy from the universe in the first place. But even there, the collapse of imperial authority would lead to unprecedented chaos as the noble houses turned on one another and the underhive gangs carved up the corpse of civilization. And what of the Space Marine chapters? Those superhuman warriors who had served as the Imperium's sword and shield for 10 millennia. I had felt their psychic emanations earlier, the confusion and growing despair as they realized that their father emperor was truly gone. Some chapters would remain steadfast, clinging to their duty even in the face of ultimate defeat. But others, particularly those with unstable gene seed or histories of rebellion, might see the Emperor's death as validation of their own doubts about the Imperial Creed. The thought of Chaos Space Marines leading revolts across the galaxy while their loyalist brothers fought desperately to maintain order filled me with a despair so profound that I nearly collapsed under its weight. The civil wars that would follow the Emperor's death would make the Horus heresy look like a minor border dispute. A new tremor shook the mountain, and this time I felt something crack inside my skull. The psychic pressure of the warp pressing against real space was becoming unbearable, and my enhanced senses were beginning to fail under the strain. Blood trickled from my nose and ears as the barriers in my mind, carefully constructed through decades of training and discipline, began to crumble. The daemon noticed my distress and smiled, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like polished obsidian. You feel it, don't you? The weight of truth pressing down upon your fragile sanity. Soon you will understand what we have always known. Order is an illusion. Law is a lie. Only chaos is eternal. I tried to block out its words, to focus on the mental exercises that had sustained me through a century of psychic trials. But the techniques that had once come as naturally as breathing now seemed impossible to execute. Without the Emperor's light to anchor my soul, I was adrift in a sea of madness, and the daemon's voice was the only constant in the growing storm. More shapes were emerging from the cracks in the walls now, things that defied description or rational thought. Some were beautiful in their alien perfection, others were hideous beyond the capacity of human language to convey. All of them were wrong, violations of natural law that should not have been able to exist in real space. Yet here they were, solid and undeniable, proof that the barriers between dimensions were failing faster than anyone had anticipated. One of the creatures, a thing that seemed to be composed entirely of shifting geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "The great game begins anew," it said, though its words seemed to bypass my ears entirely and echo directly inside my mind. "For 10 millennia we have been constrained, forced to work through mortal agents and whispered temptations. Now we are free to act openly, and the galaxy shall know the true meaning of despair." I wanted to argue, to deny the truth of its words, but what defense could I offer? The evidence was all around me, in the failing technology, the collapsing psychic networks, the growing chaos that was consuming Terra itself. Within hours, daemons would be walking openly in the streets of the imperial capital, and there would be nothing the remaining defenders could do to stop them. The Vox channels were beginning to fail now, the machine spirits that maintained communication across the Sol system finally succumbing to the psychic pressure. The last coherent transmission I received came from Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, his voice distorted by interference but still recognizably human. "All loyal servants of the Emperor," he declared, his words heavy with grim determination. "This is Marshal Helbrecht speaking from the battle barge Eternal Crusader. We have received reports of widespread disorder throughout the system, but we will not yield to despair. The Black Templars will continue our eternal crusade until the last of us falls. The Emperor may be gone, but his ideals survive in our hearts and our actions. We go now to make war upon the enemies of mankind. Wherever they may be found, the Emperor protects, even in death." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static in its wake. I knew that Helbrecht would be true to his word, that the Black Templars would fight until the very end, but what could one chapter accomplish against the forces that were even now massing in the warp? They would die as heroes, certainly, but their heroism would change nothing. The galaxy belonged to chaos now, and all the noble gestures in the universe could not alter that fundamental truth. The daemon that had been taunting me throughout the ordeal suddenly straightened, its attention drawn to something beyond the confines of the crumbling sanctum. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of genuine excitement. "Ah," it said, its golden eyes brightening with anticipation. "It begins. The first of the great rituals is commencing. Can you feel it, little astropath? The weight of 10,000 years of accumulated faith and fear being unleashed all at once?" I did feel it, a pressure building in the immaterium that made my previous suffering seem trivial by comparison. Somewhere in the galaxy, one of the Chaos Gods was beginning to manifest its full power in real space, no longer constrained by the Emperor's will or the laws of physics. The psychic shockwave of such an event would be felt on every world, by every living soul, and the madness that followed would make the current crisis seem like a moment of perfect sanity. The floor beneath my feet began to buckle and crack, the ancient stone unable to withstand the forces being unleashed. Through the widening fissures, I could see glimpses of other places, other times. There was a battlefield on some distant world where space marines fought desperately against a tide of daemons. There was a hive city burning under a sky that had turned the color of blood. There was a forge world where the tech priests had begun dismantling their own augmetics in a frenzy of self-destruction. All of this was happening now, simultaneously, across the length and breadth of the galaxy. The death of the Emperor had not merely ended an era, it had torn holes in the fabric of space-time itself, allowing chaos to bleed through from every possible timeline and dimension. Past, present, and future were becoming meaningless concepts as reality itself began to unravel. I tried to stand, to flee the sanctum before it collapsed entirely, but my legs would no longer support my weight. The psychic pressure was crushing, driving me to my knees as my enhanced nervous system overloaded on sensory input from across the galaxy. I could hear the screams of dying worlds, the laughter of triumphant demons, the desperate prayers of the faithful who had not yet realized that their God could no longer hear them. Through it all, the daemon watched me with something that might have been pity. "Do not struggle so, little astropath," it said, its voice oddly gentle now. "Your pain will end soon enough. When the transformation is complete, you will understand that this was never an ending but a beginning. Humanity's childhood is over. It is time to embrace a more mature relationship with the universe." I wanted to spit defiance, to curse the creature and all its kind, but I could barely draw breath through the psychic maelstrom that was tearing apart my consciousness. Instead, I found myself thinking of the oath I had sworn when I became an astropath, the vows of service and sacrifice that had defined my existence for over a century. "I will serve the Emperor until my death," I had sworn, kneeling before his golden throne while the ritual fires burned away my sight. "I will be his voice in the darkness, his light in the void, his will made manifest across the stars." Those words had sustained me through every trial, every moment of doubt, every psychic assault that had threatened to tear apart my sanity. Even now, with the Emperor dead and the oath meaningless, I found comfort in their familiar cadence. Perhaps that was what separated humanity from the daemons after all. Even in the face of ultimate defeat, we clung to our principles, to the ideals that had made us more than mere animals competing for survival in an uncaring universe. The daemon seemed to sense my thoughts, and its expression shifted to one of genuine curiosity. "Fascinating," it mused, tilting its horned head to one side. "Even now, with absolute proof of your God's mortality laid before you, you maintain your faith. Tell me, little astropath, what is the point of believing in something that has demonstrably failed?" It was a fair question, one that I had asked myself in the darkest moments of my service. Why continue to serve a being who allowed such suffering to exist in his name? Why maintain faith in a system that ground billions of souls to dust in the name of order and progress? I had never found a satisfactory answer, but I had continued anyway, because the alternative was to embrace the very chaos and despair that now threatened to consume everything I had ever cared about. "Because," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "faith is not about whether the object of that faith deserves it. Faith is about choosing to believe that things can be better than they are, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. The Emperor may be dead, but the ideals he represented can survive if we choose to carry them forward." The daemon's laughter was not mocking this time, but something closer to genuine amusement. "And what will you carry forward, little astropath? The rigid orthodoxy that stifled innovation for 10 millennia. The brutal repression that turned entire worlds into graveyards. The xenophobia that prevented your species from learning from the wisdom of others." Each accusation struck home, because each contained more than a grain of truth. The Imperium had been many things during its long existence, but it had not been kind, or just, or particularly wise. It had been a necessary evil at best, a bulwark against the darkness that had sacrificed moral purity for practical survival. Yet for all its flaws, it had been better than the alternatives. Under imperial rule, humanity had spread across the galaxy, had built great works that would endure for millennia, had created art and literature and philosophy that elevated the soul even as the body suffered under the weight of necessity. "I will carry forward the part that mattered," I said, though I was not entirely certain what that meant. The part that said every human life has value. The part that refused to surrender to despair. The part that looked at an impossible universe and declared that we would make it better through our own efforts. The words seemed to have an unexpected effect on the daemon. Its form flickered, becoming momentarily translucent, and for just an instant I thought I saw something else beneath its monstrous exterior. Something that might once have been human, long ago, before it had been twisted by the warp's influence into its current shape. "You speak of hope," it said, and for the first time its voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But hope is the cruelest joke of all. We have watched civilizations rise and fall across the eons, each one convinced that it would be different from those that came before, each one eventually ground to dust by forces beyond its understanding or control. What makes you think humanity will be any different?" It was another fair question, and one I could not answer with any certainty. Every civilization did fall eventually, consumed by war or plague or simple entropy. The imperium of man had lasted longer than most, but even it was now crumbling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Perhaps the daemon was right. Perhaps hope was just another form of delusion, a comforting lie that made existence bearable in the face of ultimate meaninglessness. But if that were true, then the daemon's victory was also meaningless. Chaos might triumph over order, darkness might consume light, but in the end all of it would fade to nothing as the universe reached maximum entropy and died its cold death among the distant stars. If nothing mattered, then it did not matter whether humanity served the Emperor or the dark gods or no gods at all. "Maybe hope is a lie," I said, the words coming slowly as I worked through the implications. "Maybe we are all deluding ourselves about the possibility of lasting change. But if that is true, then your victory is equally hollow. Chaos may destroy order, but it cannot create anything meaningful in its place. In the end, we are all just rearranging the furniture on a ship that is already sinking." The daemon's form wavered again, and this time I was certain I saw something human in its eyes. "You understand more than most," it said quietly. "Perhaps that is why we have allowed you to live this long. Most mortals faced with the truth of their situation either go mad or surrender immediately. But you continue to think, to question, to resist even when resistance is futile. It is almost admirable. Almost admirable. The faint praise from a creature of pure evil should have meant nothing to me, but somehow it felt like a victory. If I could maintain my humanity even in the face of absolute corruption, then perhaps others could as well. Perhaps somewhere in the galaxy, other imperial servants were holding fast to their principles even as their world collapsed around them. Perhaps the light that had guided humanity for 10 millennia was not entirely extinguished after all. The thought gave me strength to push myself back to my feet, though the effort left me dizzy and nauseous. The sanctum was barely recognizable now, its walls covered in writhing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The blessed oils that had once kept the darkness at bay were all burned out, their protective influence replaced by the sickly phosphorescence that leaked through from the warp. Yet I was still alive, still sane, still capable of thought and choice. That had to count for something, even in the face of cosmic indifference. The daemon seemed to read my thoughts, and its expression shifted once more, this time to something approaching respect. "You are stronger than I anticipated, little astropath. Most of your kind have already succumbed to madness or despair. Yet here you stand, clinging to your principles like a drowning man clutches driftwood. And what of you?" I asked, meeting its golden gaze without flinching. "You speak of the futility of hope, yet you seem genuinely interested in my responses. If nothing matters, why waste time in conversation with a dying mortal?" The question struck deeper than I had intended. The daemon's form flickered again, and for a moment I saw it clearly, the human soul trapped within layers of demonic corruption. It had been a psyker once, like me, Someone who had reached into the warp seeking knowledge or power and found instead an eternity of service to forces beyond mortal comprehension. Because, it said, its voice barely above a whisper, in 10,000 years of existence, you are the first mortal to ask me that question, the first to suggest that my choices might be as constrained as your own. The admission hung between us like a bridge across an impossible gulf. Here was a creature of pure chaos, a being that should have been incapable of doubt or introspection, revealing that it too was trapped by forces beyond its control. Perhaps that was the true horror of the warp, not that it was alien and incomprehensible, but that it was all too human in its contradictions and suffering. Before I could respond, the sanctum was shaken by another tremor, this one strong enough to bring down the remainder of the ceiling. As the ancient stones crashed to the floor around us, I caught a glimpse of the sky beyond, and what I saw there filled me with a terror that transcended rational thought. The stars were going out, not dimming or flickering, but simply ceasing to exist, winking out of reality one by one as the expanding chaos storms consumed them. The familiar constellations that had guided humanity since its first tentative steps into space were being devoured by an encroaching darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The final phase, the daemon said, following my gaze to the dying sky. With the Astronomicon extinguished, the warp storms are no longer constrained by geography or physics. They will continue to expand until they consume everything, every star, every world, every trace of matter and energy in the galaxy. In the end, only chaos will remain, eternal and unchanging in its perfect emptiness. I watched another constellation disappear, taking with it the light of 1 billion suns and the hopes of countless civilizations. Somewhere among those extinguished stars were worlds I had visited in spirit during my years of service, places where I had delivered messages of hope and guidance to isolated populations struggling to survive in the galaxy's dark corners. All of that was gone now, erased from existence as if it had never been. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm me completely, I found myself thinking of the Black Templars and Marshal Helbrecht's final transmission. They had known the truth of their situation, had understood that their cause was hopeless, but they had chosen to fight anyway. Not because they believed they could win, but because the act of resistance itself had meaning, even in the face of inevitable defeat. Perhaps that was what the Emperor had truly represented all along. Not a god or a savior, but a symbol of humanity's refusal to surrender to the darkness. His death had not diminished that symbol, but had instead revealed its true nature. The light that mattered was not the psychic beacon that had guided ships through the warp, but the flame of defiance that burned in the hearts of those who chose to stand against impossible odds. I turned back to the daemon, whose form was now beginning to fade as the sanctum collapsed completely around us. "You may be right about the futility of hope," I said, raising my voice above the sound of falling stone. "But you are wrong about one thing. This is not an ending. It is a choice." "What choice?" the creature asked, genuine curiosity evident in its voice. "The choice to remain human, even when humanity itself is ending. The choice to hold fast to our principles, even when they serve no practical purpose. The choice to believe in something greater than ourselves, even when that something has demonstrably failed." The daemon's laughter was different now, tinged with something that might have been sorrow. "And what will that choice accomplish, little astropath? The stars will still die. The galaxy will still be consumed. Your species will still face extinction. Maybe nothing," I admitted. "But maybe everything. Perhaps somewhere in the galaxy others are making the same choice. Perhaps the light that guided us for 10 millennia was never about one man on a golden throne, but about the collective decision of billions of souls to reject despair and embrace hope, no matter how foolish that hope might seem." The daemon's form wavered one final time, and for just an instant I saw not a creature of chaos but a fellow human being, trapped and corrupted but still fundamentally recognizable. "I remember making that choice once," it said softly. "Long ago when I was still mortal. I wonder what might have been different if I had held to it longer. Then it was gone, dissolved into the chaotic energies that now filled the air like a malignant fog. I was alone in the ruins of my sanctum, surrounded by the debris of a collapsed ceiling and the growing sound of Terra's death throes echoing through the mountain. I could have remained there, could have allowed myself to be buried beneath the rubble and avoided witnessing whatever horrors were yet to come. But that would have been surrender, and surrender was the one thing I could not allow myself, not while consciousness remained. Instead, I began picking my way through the debris, searching for a path to the surface. It took me nearly an hour to climb through the collapsed passages and emergency shafts that had once provided access to my sanctum. By the time I finally emerged into the open air, the transformation of Terra was already far advanced. The sky had turned the color of old blood, shot through with veins of sickly green that pulsed with their own internal light. In the distance, I could see the great hive spires burning, their adamantine walls cracking under the pressure of forces they had never been designed to withstand. But I was not alone on the mountain's peak. Scattered across the rocky plateau were perhaps a dozen other figures, some in the robes of the Adeptus Astronomica, others wearing the armor of imperial guardsmen or the simple garments of palace servitors. All of them had the same expression of stunned disbelief, the look of people who had watched their entire universe collapse in the span of a few hours. One of them, a young woman whose astropath tattoos were still fresh and dark against her pale skin, looked up as I approached. "Prime Thene," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "What are your orders?" Orders. The question almost made me laugh, though I managed to suppress the impulse. What orders could I give in the face of universal collapse? What possible course of action could address a crisis of this magnitude? And yet, as I looked at the small group of survivors, I realized that the question itself was significant. They had not asked me to explain what had happened, or to provide comfort in the face of the impossible. They had asked for orders, for direction, for some indication of how to proceed in a situation that had no precedent in human history. They were looking to me not as a source of answers, but as a symbol of continuity, a reminder that the structures and hierarchies that had sustained them still existed, even if only in shadow. "We survive," I said, the words coming more easily than I had expected. "We bear witness, we remember what was, and we preserve what we can of what should be." It was not much of a plan, perhaps not even a plan at all, but it was something to hold on to in the chaos that was consuming everything we had ever known. One by one, the other survivors nodded their understanding, and I saw in their eyes the same flame of defiance that had sustained me through my confrontation with the daemon. We were the last remnants of the Imperium of Man, a handful of broken souls clinging to the memory of a dead dream. But we were still human, still capable of choice, still able to decide what our lives would mean in whatever time remained to us. That was not nothing, that was everything. As the stars continued to die overhead and the galaxy burned around us, we began the long work of bearing witness to humanity's final chapter. And in that simple act of remembrance, in our refusal to let the darkness claim the last traces of what we had been, perhaps we ensured that the light of human consciousness would never be entirely extinguished, no matter how deep the surrounding darkness might grow. The Emperor was dead, and with him died the Imperium of Man. But humanity itself lived on, not in grand palaces or mighty fleets, but in the hearts of those who chose to remain human even as their world ended around them. In the end, perhaps that was enough. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of burning cities and the distant sound of laughter that belonged to no throat designed by nature. But it also carried something else, something that took me a moment to identify. It was the sound of human voices, raised not in despair but in defiant song. Somewhere in the dying hive below, the survivors were singing the old hymns, the songs of faith and hope that had sustained their ancestors through 10 millennia of darkness. The words were faint and distorted by distance, but their meaning was unmistakable. "The Emperor protects," they sang, their voices growing stronger with each repetition. "The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects." He did not, could not protect them any longer. But they sang anyway, and in their song was everything that had ever made humanity worth preserving. Not perfection, not victory, but the stubborn refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of absolute defeat. I closed my eyes and added my own voice to theirs, letting the familiar words carry away some small portion of the pain that had settled in my chest like a physical weight. Around me, I heard the other survivors join in, their voices blending with mine and with the distant chorus until it seemed as if all of Terra was singing together one final time. When the song ended, silence fell across the mountain, broken only by the wind and the distant sounds of a world in its death throes. But the silence was different now, not empty but expectant, as if the universe itself was waiting to see what choice humanity would make in its final moments. We chose to endure, we chose to remember, we chose to remain human, no matter what the cost. And in that choice, perhaps the Emperor found the immortality that had eluded him in life, not as a god ruling from a golden throne, but as an idea, a symbol of everything that was best in the human spirit. The Imperium might fall, the galaxy might burn, but as long as even one human soul remembered what it meant to hope in the face of despair, he would live on. The Daemon had been wrong about one thing: this was not an ending. It was a beginning.